My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been introduced with a soft smile and a smaller title than I earned. Daughter of a manufacturing magnate, wife of an ambitious executive, mother of one thoughtful little boy. If you ask the people who've known me for years, they would probably describe me as composed, polite, reasonable. The kind of woman who remembers birthdays, who hosts dinners that feel effortless, who keeps conversations smooth when egos threaten to crack the porcelain. What they wouldn't say is that I listen more than I speak. They wouldn't mention that I remember everything. I grew up in Boston, in a family where power never needed to be raised. My father built Carter Industrial from a regional supplier into a multinational empire. At our dinner table, negotiations were disguised as casual conversation. Loyalty was currency. Silence was a strategy. I learned early that influence rarely announces itself. When I married Daniel Hayes, people said it was a perfect match. He was brilliant, driven, and magnetic in boardrooms. The kind of man investors trust instinctively. My father admired him. The board respected him. Even I admired him. For years, I believed we were partners. But sometimes partnership is a story one person tells, while the other writes a plan. This isn't a story about dramatic betrayals or explosive confrontations. There were no shattered glasses, no screaming matches in marble hallways. The shift happened quietly. So quietly that at first, I thought I imagined it. It began with something small. A glance held too long. A decision made without me. A sentence spoken in a tone I had never heard before. And then one day, I understood something that rearranged my entire marriage. I wasn't standing beside him. I was positioned in front of him. When I realized I had become a stepping stone in his careful ascent toward my father's chairman's seat. When I understood that my marriage had been folded into a larger strategy, I had a choice. I could confront him and risk being dismissed as emotional, or I could do what I was raised to do: observe, document, decide. This is the story of how I discovered I was only a pawn in a long game of power, and how I chose to step off the board entirely. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity. Because sometimes the quietest move changes everything. Have you ever sensed that something in your life felt slightly misaligned, long before you could prove it? Before I became a problem, I was an accessory. That's not self-pity, it's a classification. In my father's world, I was Evelyn, who handles the foundation. In Daniel's world, I was my wife, who understands the company culture. In board meetings, when I attended as a courtesy invite, I was the quiet observer with elegant handwriting and thoughtful nods. I was useful, but not threatening. Present, but not central. The Carter name carried weight in Boston's industrial circles, but I carried it lightly. I chose philanthropy deliberately. It gave me proximity without direct rivalry. While my father and the board debated acquisitions and supply chains, I managed hospital endowments and scholarship funds. Public-facing, benevolent, harmless, or so they believed. At company galas, Daniel shone. He had a way of holding a room, shoulders squared, laughter calibrated, ambition disguised as loyalty. When he spoke about the company's future, he said, "we," and the board smiled approvingly. I would stand beside him, hand resting softly on his arm, listening. What most people didn't realize is that I had grown up in those boardrooms. I knew which directors feared risk, which ones valued stability over innovation, which ones felt indebted to my father personally rather than contractually. I knew the architecture beneath the performance, but I also knew my role. From childhood, I had been the agreeable one. My younger brother rebelled loudly. I learned influence by compliance. My father often said, "Evelyn doesn't make noise, she makes sense." It was a compliment, one that quietly placed me outside the arena. When Daniel and I married, some industry friends joked that he had married into the throne. He would laugh, shake his head, and say, "I married for love." And I believed him. I believed that our partnership was built on mutual respect, that his late nights were fueled by drive, not calculation, that his careful cultivation of my father's trust was professional dedication, not positioning. When he asked my opinion about restructuring divisions, I gave it freely. When he vented about resistant board members, I offered perspective, never realizing how precisely my insights fit into his strategy. At dinners with my father, Daniel would occasionally defer to me. Evelyn grew up around this. What do you think? It sounded like inclusion. It felt like validation. But looking back, I see something else. He wasn't inviting my voice. He was displaying it. There's a difference. To my father, I was still the composed daughter who preferred charity luncheons to quarterly earnings calls. To Daniel, I was credibility embodied, the bridge between legacy and ambition. And to myself, I was content. That might be the hardest part to admit. I wasn't oppressed. I wasn't ignored entirely. I had comfort, respect, and influence in subtle forms. I told myself that not wanting the chairman's seat meant I didn't need to compete for it. But invisibility doesn't always feel like erasure at first. Sometimes it feels like peace. I didn't notice when the perception shifted from Evelyn, the thoughtful one, to Evelyn, the reliable one. And from reliable to predictable. And from predictable to strategically positioned. Because when you've spent your life being underestimated gently, you learn to live inside that softness. You don't question it, not until the day you realize it was never softness at all. It was placement. The first sign wasn't loud enough to call betrayal. It was a tone. We were at my father's townhouse on Beacon Hill. Sunday dinner. The kind that blends business and family so seamlessly you forget where one ends and the other begins. The dining table was set with my mother's old silver. The conversation drifted, as it always did, toward the company. Daniel had been presenting a proposal for expanding into a new European distribution partnership. He spoke confidently, measured, outlining risks with just enough caution to appear responsible. My father listened without interrupting. That was his way. At one point, Daniel paused and said, "Evelyn actually mentioned something similar months ago." I looked up, mildly surprised. He continued, "She has good instincts about long-term positioning." The room gave me polite smiles. I nodded slightly. Then my father asked me directly, "Is that right?" Before I could answer, Daniel spoke again. What she meant, he clarified smoothly, was that legacy relationships matter more than rapid expansion. It's a conservative perspective. Conservative. It was such a small word. Neutral. Even reasonable. But it wasn't what I had said months ago. What I had actually told him, late one evening in our kitchen, was that the European partner's board was unstable and likely to shift leadership within a year. That the move could be strategic, if timed after the transition. Not conservative, calculated. I opened my mouth gently. I was suggesting Daniel touched my hand under the table. Light pressure. A signal. "It's nothing major," he added casually to my father. "Just thoughtful caution. She keeps me balanced." Balanced. The conversation moved on. No one noticed. But I felt it. It wasn't that he disagreed with me. It wasn't even that he reframed my idea. It was the ease with which he translated my insight into something softer, safer, less strategically sharp, and the subtle positioning of himself as the final interpreter. Later that night, as we drove home, I asked lightly, "Why did you call it conservative?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Because that's how your father hears you best." I studied his profile. Calm, certain. "You think he wouldn't hear me otherwise?" He smiled faintly. "Ev, your strength is stability. Mine is expansion. It works." There it was again. Works. Not true. Not accurate. Not fair. Works. For whom? I didn't argue. I told myself it was semantics. That Daniel understood board psychology better in that moment. That maybe I was being overly sensitive. But I wrote it down. That night, in my slim leather notebook, the one everyone assumed was filled with gratitude lists and charity pledges, I recorded the exchange almost verbatim. Not because I felt wounded, because I felt shifted. It was the first time I sensed that my words, once offered freely in private, were being repackaged publicly. Not credited, not erased. Adjusted. And I couldn't quite explain why that unsettled me. Weeks later, at a smaller executive gathering, something similar happened. Daniel referenced family alignment when discussing long-term succession. He glanced at me briefly when he said it, as if to anchor the phrase visually. Family alignment. Again, subtle. But alignment implies positioning, and positioning implies movement. Still, no one else saw anything unusual. To them, we were united, harmonious, strategic together. I began to pay closer attention, not suspiciously, just attentively. How often did he pre-interpret my perspective before I could articulate it? How often did my presence validate his proposals without me speaking at all? The cuts were small, paper thin. But paper cuts sting not because they're deep, but because they repeat. And something inside me, very quietly, stopped assuming coincidence. The mind has a remarkable ability to soften what it doesn't want to confront. After that first small cut, I told myself it was strategic alignment. Marriage, after all, is about presenting unity. Corporate leadership even more so. I had grown up watching my parents navigate disagreement privately and display cohesion publicly. It was discipline, not deception. So when it happened again, I adjusted instead of objecting. At a quarterly advisory dinner, one of the senior board members, Mr. Langford, who had known me since I was 12, asked whether the Foundation's recent sustainability initiatives were connected to Daniel's proposed operational shift. Before I could respond, Daniel answered, "Evelyn's initiatives are more about optics. Mine are about scalability." Optics. The word floated across the table like a silk scarf. Light, dismissible, harmless. I smiled. "They're aligned in long-term impact," I added gently. But the hierarchy had already been established. Optics versus scalability. Soft versus structural. Decorative versus decisive. No one challenged it. Why would they? It wasn't an insult. It was a categorization. And I had spent my entire life being categorized politely. On the drive home, I told myself he didn't mean it that way. Daniel often moved quickly in conversations. He summarized. He streamlined. Perhaps he simply didn't notice how those distinctions accumulated, because they were accumulating. At social events, I noticed something new in the way introductions were framed. "This is my wife, Evelyn. She keeps our public image flawless. She's incredible with people. She's the heart of the company." The heart. He always positioned himself as the engine. I began to recognize the pattern. Emotion assigned to me. Strategy reserved for him. What unsettled me most wasn't the language itself, it was how effortlessly it shaped perception. Board members began directing operational questions exclusively to Daniel, even when I had historical knowledge that predated his involvement. When I offered context, they listened politely, then turned back to him for confirmation. It was subtle, gradual, and because it was gradual, I rationalized it. "He's climbing. That's natural. You don't even want the chairman's seat." "This is ego, Evelyn. Let it go." I had never wanted public authority, but I had always assumed my mind carried equal weight within my marriage. That assumption began to thin. One evening, after Daniel returned from a private lunch with my father, he seemed unusually energized. Focused. "How did it go?" I asked. "Productive," he said. "We talked succession planning. Long term." The phrase hung in the air. "And?" I prompted. He shrugged casually. "Your father values continuity, stability. He wants someone who understands the culture deeply." I felt a flicker of warmth. "That makes sense." Daniel glanced at me, then away. "He also wants someone decisive." It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. A gentle contrast embedded inside a compliment. I studied him. "Are you positioning yourself?" He laughed lightly. "Ev, I'm positioning the company." Again, translation. Reframing. I wanted to believe him, so I did. That night, though, I added more entries to my notebook. Not accusations. Observations. Dates. Phrases. Context. Not because I planned to use them, because I needed to see the pattern clearly on paper. There's a moment when repeated dismissal stops feeling accidental. It begins to feel intentional, not malicious, just directional. Like furniture being slowly rearranged while you're still in the room. I noticed how often Daniel referenced my father's trust in me when advocating for his own proposals. "Your daughter agrees we should modernize. Evelyn sees the long-term benefit." Sometimes I hadn't even expressed an opinion yet. I was becoming a silent endorsement. And I told myself it was fine, because we were married. Because success for him meant security for us. Because challenging him publicly would destabilize the very image my father respected. I normalized it the way capable women often do. By absorbing it, by minimizing it, by convincing myself that the discomfort was pride, not principle. But normalization has a cost. Each time I let it pass, something inside me recalibrated, not toward submission, but toward awareness. I stopped reacting emotionally. I started listening analytically. And the more analytically I listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't carelessness. It was construction. And I was being built into something I had never agreed to be. It's a strange thing to realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. The awareness didn't arrive dramatically. It came during a board retreat in Maine. 3 days of strategy sessions, informal dinners, and the kind of controlled vulnerability executives perform to build trust. I attended as I always did. Officially, I was there to present the Foundation's annual impact report. Unofficially, I was the bridge. The living symbol of continuity between my father's legacy and whatever future leadership would look like. On the second afternoon, I stepped out onto the terrace for air. Through the open conference room doors, I could hear Daniel speaking. What the company needs now is evolution without disrupting legacy. Stability people recognize, with the decisiveness to modernize. Someone asked, "And you believe you embody both?" A pause. "I believe I understand what stability looks like," he said carefully. "I live with it." Soft laughter around the table. I didn't need to see their faces to understand the implication. I live with it. I wasn't a partner in that sentence. I was evidence. Later that evening, one of the newer board members approached me by the fire pit. He was cordial, slightly nervous around the family. "You must be proud," he said. "Of what?" I asked gently. "Of Daniel. He's positioning himself brilliantly. And having you, well, that reassures everyone." Reassures. How so? He hesitated, choosing words carefully. "You represent continuity. If you support him, it signals your father's comfort. It makes succession smoother." Succession. The word settled differently this time. Not abstract, not theoretical. Operational. I smiled politely and excused myself, but something inside me went very still. For years, I had believed I was choosing the quieter path. Philanthropy over operations. Influence over authority. I thought my restraint was autonomy. Now I saw something else. My restraint was being interpreted as endorsement. My composure as compliance. My silence as consent. Daniel wasn't diminishing me in public because he underestimated me. He was doing it because it clarified the hierarchy. He was decisive. I was stabilizing. He was forward-facing. I was foundational. He was a leader. I was legacy. It was elegant, strategically elegant, and I had helped build it. Every time I deferred publicly, every time I allowed him to translate my ideas, every time I chose harmony over precision, I wasn't invisible. I was positioned. The realization wasn't explosive. It was almost clinical, like reviewing architectural blueprints and recognizing your name on a supporting beam. Not the headline, but essential to the structure. I went back to our suite that night before Daniel. I sat at the small writing desk by the window and opened my notebook. For the first time, I didn't just record phrases. I drew a diagram. Father, board, Daniel, me. Arrows of influence. Points of validation. Moments where my presence reduced resistance to his proposals. It was startlingly clear on paper. If Daniel wanted the chairman's seat, he didn't need to defeat my father. He needed to inherit him. And I was the bridge. Not because I was weak, because I was trusted. That trust, my father's trust, the board's comfort with me, was the stabilizing factor in Daniel's ascent. As long as I appeared aligned, his ambition looked organic. Seamless. Family approved. I wasn't an obstacle. I was infrastructure. The painful part wasn't that he was ambitious. Ambition isn't betrayal. The painful part was that he had never once asked whether I consented to being part of that architecture. He had assumed it. Or worse, designed it. When Daniel returned later that night, relaxed from bourbon and strategic affirmation, he kissed my forehead. "Today went well," he said. "Yes," I replied calmly. "It did." He didn't notice anything different. Why would he? I was still composed, still supportive, still Evelyn. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was overreacting and started asking a more precise question. If I removed myself from the structure, what would collapse? The moment everything changed wasn't loud. It wasn't at a board meeting. It wasn't during a strategic dinner. It wasn't even something Daniel said. It happened on a Tuesday morning in my father's private office. I hadn't planned to stop by Carter Industrial Headquarters that day. I was nearby after a hospital funding review and decided, impulsively, to visit my father. No assistants announced me. I've always had that privilege. I knocked once and stepped inside. He was seated behind his desk, reading a briefing folder. He looked up, surprised but pleased. "Ev, sit." We spoke briefly about the foundation, then the conversation drifted, as it often did, toward the company's future. He leaned back in his chair, studying me in that assessing way he's had since I was a child. "Daniel's been spending a lot of time here," he said. "Yes," I replied evenly. "He's committed." I nodded. There was a pause, a different kind of pause. "He reminds me of myself at that age," my father added. I felt a flicker of recognition in his tone. Admiration mixed with calculation. "That's high praise," I said carefully. "It's accurate," he corrected. He closed the folder in front of him and folded his hands. He understands something important. Legacy survives through strength, through decisive leadership. The board responds to that. I watched him closely. "And what does legacy mean to you?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Continuity, stability. The Carter name is represented by someone capable. Someone, not necessarily family, not necessarily me." In that moment, something aligned sharply in my mind. Daniel hadn't been trying to replace my father. He had been positioning himself as the natural extension of himself. And my father, who valued strength and continuity above sentiment, was beginning to see it. "What about me?" I asked quietly. It wasn't jealousy. It was clarity. My father's expression softened slightly, almost affectionately. "You've always been steady, Evelyn. Thoughtful. You protect the family's reputation beautifully. Protect. Not lead, not decide, not command. Protect. You don't want the burden of that seat," he added gently. "It's not who you are." There it was. Not who you are. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself, I didn't even feel anger. I felt something far more unsettling. Definition. For decades, I had been defined by restraint, by diplomacy, by being the stabilizing presence in rooms filled with louder personalities. I had accepted that narrative because it suited me, but now I understand how it was being used. If I were inherently stabilizing, then Daniel was inherently decisive. If I didn't want the burden, then he was the natural candidate. And if I stood beside him smiling, then the transition would look like evolution, not acquisition. My father wasn't betraying me. He was following logic. Daniel wasn't attacking me. He was following an opportunity. And I had unknowingly made both paths easier. When I left my father's office that morning, the city felt different. Not hostile, just clearer. The shift wasn't rage. It was removal. For the first time, I stopped thinking about how to preserve harmony and started considering what it would mean to withdraw consent from the role I had been assigned. Not dramatically, not publicly, strategically. That evening, Daniel asked casually, "Did you see your father today?" "Yes." "And?" "He thinks you're decisive." Daniel smiled. "That's good." I held his gaze for a second longer than usual. "Yes," I agreed calmly. "It is." He didn't see it, but something in me had gone very still. The quiet kind of stillness that comes before deliberate movement. For years, I had been reacting to subtle shifts. Now, for the first time, I was choosing one. There's a difference between being silent and choosing silence. For years, my quiet had been instinctive, harmonizing, absorbing, translating tension into something smoother. After that Tuesday morning, my silence changed texture. It became intentional. Daniel didn't notice at first. Why would he? To him, I was still supportive, still composed, still the stabilizing presence that softened his sharper edges. But I stopped offering unfiltered insight. When he discussed potential restructuring plans at home, I listened without refining his arguments. When he floated ideas about board dynamics, I responded with measured neutrality. That's one way to see it. Interesting perspective. You'll have to decide. At first, he seemed slightly surprised. Then he adjusted. He began speaking with more certainty, less collaborative, more declarative. I watched the shift carefully. The board meetings became more revealing. Without my subtle calibrations, Daniel's decisiveness sometimes edged into impatience. He dismissed operational concerns more abruptly. He framed dissent as resistance rather than caution. No one confronted him outright, but I saw it. The micro-expressions, the exchanged glances. He was still impressive, but he was no longer buffered. At social functions, I maintained warmth. I asked thoughtful questions. I remembered details about spouses and children. I continued hosting charity events flawlessly, but I stopped anchoring his authority. When someone said, "You two make such a strong leadership pair," I smiled and replied, "Daniel's very focused on the company right now." Subtle distinction. Not we, him. Silence, when chosen deliberately, can be disorienting. Daniel began filling it. One evening, after a tense executive call, he asked, "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" "I'm listening," I said. He studied me. "You don't have feedback?" "I trust you'll handle it." The words were gentle, but they landed differently, because for years he had relied on my calibration. My read on personalities, my memory of historical tensions within the board. Now I was withholding nothing malicious, only the assumption that I would always stabilize his path. And others began to notice, though they couldn't name it. At a private dinner, one of the senior directors asked me, "What's your take on the succession timeline?" I took a sip of water before answering. "I think the board will ultimately choose whoever they believe protects the company's long-term integrity." It was a truthful answer. It was also a removal of endorsement. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. Afterward, in the car, he asked, "What was that?" "What was what?" "You didn't say anything about alignment." I turned toward him calmly, because the board doesn't need me to define alignment. He was quiet for the rest of the drive. He still believed I was steady, predictable, reliable. He didn't yet understand that reliability, when withdrawn quietly, creates instability. I wasn't sabotaging him. I wasn't undermining him. I was simply no longer participating in the architecture that framed his ascent as inevitable. And the most powerful part? No one could accuse me of anything I hadn't confronted. I hadn't criticized. I hadn't been exposed. I had chosen restraint in a different direction. Silence mistaken for weakness can be a strategic advantage, because while others assume you're passive, you're observing where the weight truly rests. And I was beginning to see exactly which pillars depended on me. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After I chose silence intentionally, I began doing something I hadn't needed to do in years. I studied, not the market, not expansion models. I already understood those. I studied structure. Carter Industrial wasn't just a company. It was a layered governance ecosystem built over 3 decades. Voting rights weren't evenly distributed. Certain legacy board members held weighted influence. Trust agreements tied to family holdings had conditional triggers that most executives never bothered to read in full. I had, but now I read them again, slowly, carefully. At the foundation office, I requested historical archives under the pretense of updating long-term impact reports. No one questioned it. I had overseen those records for years. Buried within old partnership documents were clauses referencing family representation in executive leadership transitions. Non-binding, but influential. I began mapping them, not to attack, to understand leverage. Meanwhile, I observed Daniel more closely, not emotionally, but operationally. He had grown confident in his momentum. His meetings with my father increased. His private dinners with select board members became more frequent. He refined his language carefully. Continuity, evolution, modernization with respect. It was skillful, but I noticed something else. He was assuming the narrative was already secured. He had grown used to my presence, smoothing doubt. My quiet nod across a table had become a signal others read instinctively. The family supports this. So I tested something small. At a mid-year strategy session, Daniel presented a timeline that felt slightly aggressive. One of the older directors hesitated, referencing historical market volatility. Normally, I would have stepped in gently. "We've weathered similar transitions before," I might have said. This time, I let the hesitation linger. The silence stretched. Another director added, "Perhaps we revisit risk modeling before accelerating." Daniel adjusted smoothly, but I saw it, the flicker of recalibration. Without my stabilizing reinforcement, resistance surfaced more easily. That night, I didn't confront him. I updated my diagram. Where influence once flowed seamlessly through me, it now encountered friction. I also began strengthening relationships quietly. Not new ones, but old ones. Mr. Langford invited me to lunch about a hospital initiative. We spoke about healthcare funding, but eventually he drifted toward company matters. "You've always had good instincts," he said. "I observe," I replied. He studied me carefully. "Your father trusts your judgment more than you realize." That was new information. I filed it away. I started scheduling foundation visits with board members' spouses again. Subtle reconnections under philanthropic contexts. Not political. Relational. Influence rarely travels through official channels alone. And then there was the voting structure. Carter family holdings controlled a significant portion of non-public shares. My father held primary authority, but certain provisions allowed temporary proxy distribution under specific circumstances. It had never been relevant. Until now. I didn't intend to use it recklessly, but I needed to understand the thresholds, the timelines, the legal pathways. Daniel assumed his path to the chairman's seat required patience and visible competence. He did not account for the possibility that the bridge could shift. At home, I remained calm, supportive, present for our son's school events, engaged at dinners. But I stopped discussing long-term succession with him entirely, and something subtle began to happen. He started trying to read me. "Are you comfortable with how things are progressing?" he asked one evening. "With what specifically?" I responded. "The company. I'm comfortable observing," I said. That word again. Observing. He nodded, but uncertainty had entered his posture. Preparation isn't loud. Its paperwork reviewed twice. Its clauses are highlighted. Its relationships remembered. Its patterns are confirmed. And the most important part? No one noticed, because I wasn't moving pieces yet. I was simply understanding the board. And once you understand the board, you're no longer a pawn. The revelation didn't feel triumphant. It felt mathematical. It came on a quiet Thursday afternoon in my father's legal advisor's office. A man who had known me since I was a child, who once kept candy in his desk drawer for me during long estate planning meetings. I had requested a review of the Carter family trust under the pretext of updating foundation alignment documents. Technically, it wasn't unusual. The foundation's endowment was intertwined with the company's non-public shares. Still, when he slid the thick binder across the polished table, his eyes lingered on me for a moment. "You're thinking long-term," he said. "I always am," I replied. We reviewed structural provisions first, distribution rights, proxy authority, and succession contingencies. Nothing I hadn't seen before. Then we reached a clause I had skimmed years ago and forgotten. In the event of transitional leadership consideration, any family trustee may request a temporary voting review period if concerns arise regarding strategic alignment with foundational principles. Foundational principles. The language was deliberately vague, crafted decades ago to preserve Carter values without defining them explicitly. "What qualifies as concern?" I asked calmly. The advisor folded his hands. "It doesn't require public conflict. Only a formal expression from a trustee asserting potential misalignment with legacy objectives." "And during that review period?" "Chairman's appointment is paused. Board must reassess under family governance oversight." Paused. Not blocked, not denied. Paused. "How long?" I asked. 90 days, potentially extendable. 90 days in corporate transition timing is significant. Markets react. Boards reconsider. Narratives shift. "And I am a trustee," I said. Not as a question. "Yes," he confirmed. "Alongside your father." I let the information settle. I didn't smile. I didn't react outwardly at all. I simply nodded and closed the binder. That was the moment I understood something essential. Daniel's strategy depended on momentum, on inevitability, on the perception that succession was a natural progression supported by family continuity. He had positioned me as a symbolic endorsement. He had not considered that I possessed procedural authority. Authority I had never exercised. Not because I couldn't, because I never needed to. As I left the office, I didn't feel powerful. I felt clear. Leverage is not about destruction. It's about optionality. For the first time, I had options independent of confrontation. If Daniel continued assuming my silent support, he would accelerate. If I invoked review, even gently, the board would be forced to reevaluate without the illusion of unanimous family alignment. And the most profound realization? I didn't need to prove betrayal. I only needed to assert misalignment. That evening, Daniel returned home unusually buoyant. "Your father scheduled a strategy session next month," he said. "It feels like movement." "Movement toward what?" I asked. He studied me carefully. "You know toward what." I held his gaze calmly. "And if the board hesitates?" I asked. "They won't," he replied. "There's alignment." Alignment. He said it with such certainty. And for a brief second, I saw the architecture fully. He believed the bridge was permanent. He believed my silence meant consent. He believed the narrative was secured. I nodded gently. "Alignment requires clarity," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened my notebook, not to record a wound this time, but to outline contingencies, trigger points, timelines, legal language. There was no celebration, no rush of victory, only stillness. Because once you understand, you are a stepping stone. You have two choices: remain in place or step aside deliberately. And I was almost ready to decide. Clarity doesn't immediately create action. It creates weight. For days after meeting with the legal advisor, I carried that weight quietly, not visibly burdened, just internally recalibrating. 90 days, a formal review period that could interrupt momentum without public accusation. It wasn't a weapon, it was a pause button. And pauses change outcomes. I began outlining my options with deliberate neutrality. Option 1. Do nothing. Allow Daniel's ascent to unfold. Maintain composure. Retain influence privately. Accept the role of stabilizing the chairman's wife. There would be comfort in that. Social continuity. Public respect. No scandal. No fracture. But there would also be something irreversible. The final confirmation that my silence had been interpreted correctly. As agreement. Option 2. Confront Daniel directly. Reveal that I understood his positioning. Demand transparency. Insist on renegotiating power within the marriage. But confrontation would force him into defense. And Daniel was formidable in defense. He would rationalize, reframe, perhaps even convince me that ambition and love could coexist without manipulation. And maybe they could, but I no longer trusted the architecture. Option 3. Invoke the review clause quietly. Not to destroy his candidacy, but to expose whether it could withstand scrutiny without my symbolic endorsement. This option was irreversible, because the moment I formally expressed concern, the board would recognize a fracture in family alignment. The illusion would dissolve, and Daniel would know it came from me, not publicly, not dramatically, but structurally. I spent an afternoon alone at our Cape house, walking along the shoreline in measured silence. The ocean in late autumn is restrained, gray, steady, unapologetic. I asked myself a single question. If I remove myself from his path, am I acting in anger or in integrity? The answer mattered. I replayed every subtle translation of my words, every strategic reframing, every time my presence had been leveraged to reduce resistance. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't humiliated me. He hadn't broken vows in obvious ways. He had simply used proximity as leverage, and proximity without consent is still extraction. By sunset, my mind was steady. I did not want the chairman's seat, but I refused to be the unexamined bridge to it. That distinction clarified everything. When I returned home that evening, Daniel was reviewing briefing materials at the dining table. He looked up. "You've been quiet this week." "I've been thinking," I replied. "About?" "Alignment." He smiled faintly. "We are aligned." I studied him, not with resentment, not with accusation, just precision. "Are we?" I asked gently. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he recovered quickly. "Of course." I nodded. That night, after he went upstairs, I drafted a formal request for governance review. The language was restrained, professional. As a Carter family trustee, I would like to request a temporary review period to ensure that forthcoming leadership decisions align fully with foundational principles and long-term legacy objectives. No mention of Daniel, no accusation, only principle. My finger hovered over the send button longer than I expected, because this was the moment, not of revenge, of definition. If I pressed send, I would no longer be infrastructure. I would be an independent variable. I closed my eyes briefly, not in doubt, but in acknowledgement. Then I sent it. There was no dramatic sound, no thunder, no immediate consequence, just a quiet shift in the architecture. And somewhere in the distance of corporate momentum, something paused. The email was sent at 10:42 p.m. By 8:15 a.m. the next morning, the response arrived from the family's legal office. Review period acknowledged. The governance committee will convene within 72 hours. No emotion, no commentary, just process. That was the beauty of structure. It didn't argue. It activated. I didn't tell Daniel. There was no strategic advantage in announcing it prematurely. Governance notices were formal. He would be informed through official channels once the committee convened. I moved through the morning as usual. School drop-off, a foundation budget call, a hospital board review. Externally, nothing shifted. Internally, everything had. At 11:30 a.m., my father called. His voice was calm but edged with curiosity. "I received your request." "Yes," I replied. "A review is a serious move." "I agree." A pause. "Do you believe there is misalignment?" he asked. This was the moment where emotion could have entered. I kept my tone steady. "I believe clarity protects legacy." Silence stretched on the line. "You're not acting impulsively," he said carefully. "No!" Another pause. Longer this time. "Very well," he concluded. "We'll proceed formally." He didn't defend Daniel. He didn't challenge me. He respected the process. That was all I needed. Daniel received the official notification mid-afternoon. I knew because he called me at 3:07 p.m., voice-controlled but tight. "What is this?" he asked. "A governance review," I replied evenly. "You initiated it." "Yes." "For what reason?" "To ensure alignment." There it was again, the word he had used so confidently. "You could have spoken to me first," he said. I let that sit for a moment. "Would it have changed anything?" I asked gently. He didn't answer immediately. "This signals doubt," he finally said. "It signals evaluation." His breath shifted slightly. Not anger, calculation. "You realize what this does to momentum." "Yes." "And you're comfortable with that?" "I'm comfortable with transparency." We ended the call without raised voices. That evening, he came home earlier than usual. The air between us wasn't hostile. It was sharpened. He removed his coat slowly. "You've complicated this." "I've clarified it," I replied. "For whom?" "For everyone." He studied me carefully, as though trying to locate the exact point where the bridge had shifted. "You don't even want the seat," he said. "That's true. Then why intervene?" I met his gaze steadily. "Because not wanting something doesn't mean I consent to being used to secure it." There was no shouting, just a precise truth placed on the table between us. The review process began quietly over the next week. Governance committee meetings, structured interviews, strategic risk reassessments. Board members who had previously assumed seamless succession now found themselves revisiting assumptions. Market analysts noticed nothing yet. Publicly, operations continued smoothly, but inside the architecture, the weight had redistributed. Daniel still attended meetings confidently, but his tone softened slightly. He referenced collective decision-making more frequently. He recalibrated. Momentum had paused, and pause forces reflection. At home, we functioned normally. Dinners, school routines, polite exchanges. But something fundamental had changed. He no longer looked at me as stabilizing infrastructure. He looked at me as an independent actor. Not hostile, not adversarial, but no longer predictable. And in corporate strategy, unpredictability is power. I hadn't taken anything from him. I had simply removed the assumption that I was part of his plan. And without that assumption, the plan had to stand on its own. The first consequences weren't loud. There were subtle shifts in temperature. At the next executive session, I attended as usual. Foundation update, community impact metrics, scholarship expansions. The atmosphere was polite and professional, but different. Where there had once been seamless forward motion, there was now careful phrasing. One board member asked Daniel, "How do you interpret the trustee's request?" "Trustee, not Evelyn." Daniel answered smoothly. "Governance reviews are part of responsible succession. I welcome the process." It was the correct answer, but something had changed in the room. Questions became more pointed. Risk scenarios were revisited. Long-term strategic modeling extended further than originally planned. Momentum had become deliberation, and deliberation exposes assumptions. After the meeting, Mr. Langford approached me quietly. "You've initiated reflection," he said. "I've requested clarity," I replied. He nodded slowly. It was needed. Needed. The word lingered. That afternoon, financial analysts within the company began requesting deeper projections on Daniel's proposed expansion timeline. Internal committees scheduled additional oversight reviews. Nothing public, nothing dramatic, but Daniel felt it. At dinner that evening, he was quieter. "They're hesitating," he said finally. "They're evaluating," I corrected gently. "They weren't before." "No," I agreed. He studied me across the table. "You've shifted perception. I've removed the assumption." His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. Over the following weeks, small losses accumulated. A board member who had been firmly supportive requested extended due diligence. An external advisor recommended that leadership continuity discussions remain open-ended. The governance committee requested that Daniel outline contingency plans for potential instability during transition. None of these were rejections, but they weren't endorsements either. Momentum depends on inevitability, and inevitability had dissolved. At a charity gala, a longtime investor approached Daniel with measured politeness. "Strong leadership withstands scrutiny," the investor said. It sounded like encouragement, but it was also a reminder. I watched Daniel absorb the shift. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't reckless. He simply hadn't anticipated resistance from within his own foundation of support. And that resistance wasn't emotional. It was procedural. My father remained composed throughout. Publicly neutral. Privately observant. One evening, he invited both of us for dinner. Over wine, he spoke carefully. "Reviews reveal strengths and weaknesses. Both are useful." Daniel nodded. "I stand by my strategy." "And Evelyn?" my father asked. "I stand by governance," I replied. It wasn't defiance. It was a principle. As weeks passed, Daniel began recalibrating his public tone even further. He emphasized collective leadership. He deferred more often in meetings. He referenced legacy values with increased frequency. He was adjusting to scrutiny, but the adjustment itself signaled something important to the board. Without unchallenged family alignment, his candidacy was no longer inevitable, and inevitability had been his greatest asset. At home, tension remained controlled. We spoke calmly. We co-parented seamlessly. But something invisible had shifted permanently. He no longer assumed my silence meant support, and the board no longer assumed my presence meant endorsement. I hadn't taken the chairman's seat. I hadn't even claimed authority. I had simply stepped out of the shadow he had designed for me. And once I did, everyone had to reassess the light. Daniel lost nothing publicly, but privately he lost certainty. And certainty, in leadership transitions, is everything. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like overcorrection. About 6 weeks into the review period, Daniel began moving differently. More carefully. More attentively. He started asking for my thoughts again, genuinely this time. "What do you think the board is most concerned about?" he asked one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway as I prepared tea. I didn't look up immediately. "Stability during transition. I can provide that." "Yes," I said softly. "But can you prove it without borrowing it?" He understood what I meant. He stepped closer. "I never borrowed anything from you." I met his eyes calmly. "You leveraged proximity. That's what partnerships do." "No," I replied gently. "Partnerships ask." The conversation ended there. Not explosive, just heavy. In the following days, Daniel increased visible gestures of deference. He publicly credited my strategic insights in meetings, accurately this time. He invited me to speak more directly during discussions. Board members noticed, but something fundamental had already shifted. When perception changes once, it doesn't fully revert. At a governance session, one director asked Daniel directly, "If the family trustee expresses hesitation, how do you address that long-term?" It was a neutral question, but it contained a fracture. Daniel answered professionally, outlining shared values and alignment goals. Yet the board now understood something they hadn't before. Family support was not automatic, and without automatic support, leadership becomes earned, not inherited. At home, Daniel's tone softened further. "I misjudged how this would feel for you," he admitted one night. That was the closest he came to acknowledgement. "Did you?" I asked. He exhaled. "I thought we were aligned." "Aligned toward what?" I asked calmly. He didn't answer immediately. "Growth," he said finally. "For the company?" "For us." There it was, the conflation. We had become indistinguishable from assent. I studied him quietly. "You never asked if I wanted to be part of that structure," I said. "I assumed." "Yes," I interrupted gently. "You assumed?" Assumption was the cornerstone of his strategy, and now that cornerstone was cracked. The governance committee extended its review by another 30 days. Publicly, this was procedural. Privately, there was hesitation. Daniel's candidacy was no longer uncontested. Other potential successors began receiving informal attention. Conversations diversified. The inevitability narrative was gone. One evening, he sat across from me at the dining table long after our son had gone to bed. "You've changed the trajectory," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I revealed it." He looked at me with something new in his expression. Not anger, not even resentment. Recognition. "You could have spoken to me," he said again. softer this time. And you could have spoken to me years ago, I answered. The truth wasn't sharp, it was settled. He realized then what he hadn't accounted for. I wasn't trying to take anything from him. I was refusing to be a part of something built without my consent. By the time the review period neared its conclusion, the board's tone had shifted from confident transition to cautious continuity. Daniel would remain in his executive role. Chairman's succession would be deferred. Officially, it was about strategic timing. Unofficially, it was about trust. And trust, once examined, cannot return to blindness. It was too late to fix, not because damage had been dramatic, but because clarity had already arrived. And clarity once seen cannot be unseen. The final conversation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in our living room, on a quiet Sunday afternoon. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic ultimatums. Just two people sitting across from each other, finally speaking without strategy. Daniel had just returned from a meeting with my father. The review period had officially concluded the week before. Succession discussions were postponed indefinitely. The board would reassess in due course. Corporate language for not now. He set his briefcase down slowly and looked at me with a steadiness I hadn't seen in months. They're not moving forward, he said. I know, I replied. They said the timing isn't right. I nodded. A long silence stretched between us, not hostile, just honest. Was that what you wanted? He asked finally. The question wasn't sharp. It was searching. I wanted transparency, I said. At this cost? What cost? I asked gently. He exhaled. Momentum, positioning, years of groundwork. I held his gaze. Daniel, if your leadership depends on my silent endorsement, it isn't leadership. It's architecture. He absorbed that without defensiveness. You think I used you, he said quietly. I think you positioned me, I corrected. And that's different? Yes. He leaned back slightly, studying me in a way he never had before. Not as a stabilizing presence, not as an extension of legacy, as an equal. I didn't set out to exploit you, he said. I believe that, I replied. Then what was it? Ambition, I said calmly, and assumption. He looked down at his hands for a moment. I thought you didn't want that world, he admitted. I don't want the seat, I said, but I want agency. The word landed softly between us. Agency. For years, I had mistaken composure for power. But composure without agency is simply controlled participation. I see that now, he said quietly. There was no apology dramatic enough to rewrite the past. And I wasn't asking for one. This isn't about punishing you, I continued. It's about redefining the terms. He nodded slowly. And what are the terms now? That I am not infrastructure, I said. Not leverage, not proof of alignment. And if the board approaches me again? He asked. Then you stand on your own. Another silence. Would you oppose me? He asked carefully. No, I replied. Would you support me? I would evaluate you. The honesty in that answer shifted something deeper than any argument could have. He gave a small, almost incredulous smile. That's colder than I expected. It's fairer than silence, I said. We sat there for a while. Not as adversaries, not even as rivals. As two adults recalibrate the balance of power inside a marriage that had quietly drifted into a hierarchy. I underestimated you, he said finally. No, I replied. You defined me. And now? Now, I said calmly. I define myself. There was no dramatic resolution in that moment. No embrace. No breakdown. Just recognition. The bridge had not been burned. It had been dismantled. And whatever would be built next, if anything, would require consent from both sides. Not an assumption, not positioning, but choice. It has been 18 months since the review period ended. Carter Industrial remains strong. My father still holds the chairman's seat. Daniel continues as executive vice president. Respected, capable, recalibrated. And I am no longer infrastructure. The shift in my identity didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, the way most lasting transformations do. At first, there was space, the space where the assumption used to sit. Space where I once anticipated needs before they were spoken. Space where my silence had functioned as endorsement. In that space, I began speaking differently. Not more loudly, but more directly. In board meetings, when asked for my perspective, I no longer softened my conclusions to protect comfort. I articulated them fully and let others sit with the weight. If someone attempted to translate my words, I gently clarified them myself. No, what I meant was... Small corrections, clean edges, And something remarkable happened. No one pushed back. Because authority doesn't require volume. It requires clarity. My father, perhaps more than anyone, adjusted his perception. One afternoon in his office, he said, almost thoughtfully, "You've grown sharper." "I've grown clearer," I replied. He studied me for a long moment. "I misread you," he admitted. "You read what I allowed you to see," I said gently. That was the truth. For years I had chosen diplomacy over definition. It made rooms easier. It made relationships smoother. But smooth isn't the same as strong. Daniel and I still share a home. We co-parent seamlessly. We host dinners that feel composed and elegant. But our dynamic has changed. He no longer speaks for me. He asks. And when he doesn't, I answer for myself. There are moments when I see a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, yes, but also caution. Not fear. Not resentment. Awareness. He understands now that my quiet is not absence. It is a decision. As for the chairman's seat, I still don't want it. Not because I doubt my ability, but because power, when truly understood, isn't always about position. It's about leverage, timing, and self-definition. I have expanded the Foundation's initiatives into governance training for women entering corporate leadership. Not as activism, as preparation, because I have learned something essential. Underestimation can be a shield, but it can also be a trap. The difference lies in whether you choose it. I no longer choose invisibility. I choose discernment. I choose agency. And perhaps most importantly, I choose not to stand where I am not consciously standing. There is no bitterness in me, no desire to undo what happened. Because without that quiet repositioning, I might never have examined the architecture at all. And once you see the structure clearly, you never mistake placement for peace again. When I first realized I had been positioned as a stepping stone, I thought the story would end in confrontation, in exposure, in separation, in something visibly dramatic. It didn't. It ended in definition. I did not take the chairman's seat. I did not dismantle the company. I did not humiliate the man I married. I simply removed myself from a structure built without my consent. And that was enough. There is a quiet misconception about power, that it belongs only to those who pursue the highest title, who move loudly, who dominate visibly. But real power often lives elsewhere. It lives in knowing the clauses others overlook, in recognizing when your presence is being translated into permission, in understanding that silence is not weakness, unless it is unconscious. For years, I believed harmony was strength. Now I understand something more precise. Harmony without agency is compliance. Agency without noise is dominance. I was never angry that Daniel was ambitious. I was unsettled that he never asked whether I wished to be part of that ambition. And once I understood that distinction, the path forward became simple. Not easy, but simple. If you are being positioned without consent, you don't need to shout. You need to step aside strategically. Because when you remove yourself from someone's plan, they are forced to reveal whether it can stand alone. And if it cannot, it was never a strength to begin with. Today, I am not underestimated. Not because I demanded recognition, but because I define myself clearly. And clarity, once established, rarely needs to repeat itself. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever mistaken being valued for being positioned? And if you stepped back quietly, what might shift in your world?